Harlem, 1951. Bumpy Johnson walked into a room with 12 armed men and one traitor he called a brother. They had the guns. They had the numbers. But within 10 seconds, 3 men were dead, and the Italian mob lost Harlem forever. To understand how one betrayal changed everything, we go back to where it all began. Harlem smelled like trouble that night. Not the usual kind. Not the cheap whiskey spilling out of corner bars. Not the cigarette smoke hanging over dice games in back alleys. This was something older, something thicker. The kind of smell that crawls into your lungs and stays there long after the night is over. It was late October, 1951. The kind of cold that didn't just bite, it grabbed you by the throat and squeezed. Steam rose from the grates on 116th Street, twisting up into the dark, like ghosts leaving bodies behind. The neighborhood was quiet in the way Harlem only gets quiet when something bad is already in motion, when the people who know things have already gone inside and locked their doors. Bumpy Johnson stood at the window of his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, looking down at the street below. He hadn't slept in 2 days, not because he was afraid. Bumpy Johnson didn't do afraid. He hadn't slept because he was thinking, and when Bumpy thought hard about something, sleep wasn't welcome. The message had come 3 nights ago. A folded piece of paper, no envelope, slipped under the door of his numbers operation on Lenox Avenue. 4 words and an address. We should talk. Tonight. No signature. None needed. Everyone in Harlem and half of Lower Manhattan knew who ran the Italian operation, pressing up against the edges of his territory. The Genovese family had been circling Harlem for 2 years, sending middlemen with soft voices and hard intentions, testing the borders the way a wolf tests a fence line. And now they wanted a meeting. Bumpy read the note twice, folded it once, and burned it over the kitchen stove. Then he picked up the phone. "Get me Rico," he said. Some details in this account are reconstructed from court testimonies and street-level records from the period. The full truth of that night may never be fully known. Rico Alvarez was the kind of man who existed in the space between worlds. Half Puerto Rican, half Dominican, entirely untrustworthy, and yet somehow trusted by everyone who needed a bridge between 2 sides that couldn't afford to speak directly. He had worked corners for the Italians in East Harlem. He had run numbers for Bumpy's operation on the West Side. He wore both relationships like a double-breasted suit, comfortable on either side, committed to neither. When Rico arrived at Bumpy's place 40 minutes later, he was already sweating despite the cold. "They came to you," Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. Rico sat down, without being asked a mistake, but Bumpy let it go. "They reached out through Carmine," Rico said, referring to a low-level Genovese associate who ran a butcher shop on Pleasant Avenue. "Said it's about territory. Said they want to talk numbers. Split things clean, no bloodshed." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that made men reconsider their life choices. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I'd pass the word." "That's all." "That's all," Bumpy repeated. He walked to the window again. Outside, a woman was pulling a child up the street by the wrist, moving fast, head down. Someone always knew when the air changed in Harlem. The ones who survived long enough learned to move before the storm hit. "Set the meeting," Bumpy said finally. "Tell them I'll come. Tell them I'll hear what they have to say." Rico visibly relaxed. He shouldn't have. "But Rico," Bumpy said, still looking out the window, "I'm going to tell you something one time, and I need you to carry it carefully. I know you talk to both sides. I've always known. I let it go because a man's got to eat and you've been useful. But whatever you say to them between now and that meeting, whatever extra information finds its way across the table, I will know. And we will have a very different conversation after." The room was completely silent. Rico nodded too quickly. "Of course, Bumpy. Of course." After Rico left, Bumpy made 3 more calls, each one short, each one precise. By midnight, he had men stationed at every exit of the building where the meeting would take place, a social club on East 116th, owned on paper by a retired postal worker, operated in reality by men who answered to names nobody said out loud in public. He had 2 men inside already planted an hour before the meeting was set to begin. One behind the bar, one in the back hallway near the kitchen. He had a driver waiting 2 blocks east with the engine running, and he had a man watching Rico's apartment. Not because he planned to start a war that night, but because Bumpy Johnson had survived 23 years in Harlem by understanding one fundamental truth: an invitation is never just an invitation. Every door someone opens for you was built by someone who decided how the room on the other side would be arranged. The real question, the only question that mattered, was who controlled the exits. As he buttoned his coat and checked his watch, Bumpy allowed himself one thought about what the Italians actually wanted. 30% of his numbers operation was the rumor, a guaranteed slice of Harlem's underground economy delivered monthly, no arguments. He almost smiled. They were about to learn something about Harlem that no amount of money or muscle had ever taught the people who came from outside looking in. This neighborhood didn't negotiate under pressure. It absorbed pressure, and then it pushed back in ways you never saw coming. Bumpy Johnson stepped out into the cold Harlem night alone on the sidewalk for exactly 4 seconds before falling into stride with 2 men who materialized from separate doorways without a word spoken between any of them. He didn't look back. He never looked back. The social club on East 116th had no sign above the door. It didn't need one. The men who were supposed to know about it already knew. The men who weren't supposed to know about it understood better than to ask. That was the grammar of these places: communication through absence power, signaled by what wasn't said and wasn't shown. Bumpy arrived at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the agreed time. A deliberate choice. You learn things about a room when you're the first one in. You see how the chairs are arranged. You count the exits. You notice which corners are dark on purpose. He walked through the front door with 2 men behind him and immediately felt the air shift. It was wrong. Not obviously, not in the way a gunshot is wrong, immediate and undeniable. It was wrong the way a scent changes before rain, subtle, specific, unmistakable once you'd been trained to notice it. There were too many people in the room. The agreement had been simple. 4 men per side, enough to have witnesses, not enough to constitute a show of force. It was the standard arrangement for this kind of meeting, understood by everyone who operated at this level, without ever being written down anywhere. Bumpy counted 12 men on the Italian side before he reached the center of the room. 12. He stopped walking. Behind him, he felt his 2 men stop in perfect synchrony, no signal given, none needed. 15 years of working together produced a kind of physical language that operated below the level of conscious thought. Across the room, seated at a long table with a bottle of red wine he hadn't touched, was a man Bumpy recognized but had never spoken to directly. Carmine Falcone, not a boss, not an underboss, but a capo, with ambitions that exceeded his rank, and a reputation for pushing situations past the point where reasonable men called a stop. He was perhaps 55, with heavy hands, and the kind of stillness that some men mistake for patience, and others correctly identify as coiled aggression. Falcone smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won. "Mr. Johnson," he said in a voice designed to be heard across the room. "Glad you came. What follows is based on multiple accounts that have circulated within Harlem's oral history, and while the broad facts align, some dialogue has been reconstructed to reflect the spirit of what witnesses described." Bumpy said nothing for 3 full seconds. He looked at the 12 men. He looked at the table. He looked at the 2 empty chairs positioned on the near side, positioned slightly lower than the chairs across from them, a detail so small most men wouldn't catch it, a detail Bumpy cataloged in under a second. Then he walked to the table, pulled out one of the chairs, turned it 45 degrees so it no longer faced directly across at Falcone, and sat down. It was a gesture that cost nothing and communicated everything. "I see what you're doing. I am not impressed. We will proceed on my terms, or we will not proceed." He did not look at the other chair. His second man remained standing. Falcone's smile tightened at the edges. Around the room, bodies shifted. Hands that had been resting on thighs moved slightly. The bartender, Bumpy's man, kept polishing the same glass without looking up. The man near the kitchen doorway had gone completely still. "You brought more people than we discussed," Bumpy said. His voice was flat, observational, not accusatory that would suggest he was rattled. "Things change," Falcone said. "It's a complicated time. A man takes precautions." "A man takes precautions," Bumpy repeated. He nodded slowly as though considering the philosophy of this. "Or a man makes a statement." The room absorbed that without responding. Somewhere outside, a car passed on 116th, its headlights sweeping briefly across the frosted window, above the bar, sending a pale wash of light across the far wall. In that half-second of illumination, Bumpy counted 4 more men positioned along the back wall that the initial scan hadn't caught. 16 total, at minimum. He had 2 men inside, 2 at the front exit, 1 each at the 2 rear exits, a driver, 2 blocks east, and whatever was walking through the front door behind him, which he calculated as 0 because he had closed that variable before he arrived. The mathematics of the room were not in his favor. He ordered a glass of water from the bar and waited for it to arrive before he spoke again. "So," he said when the glass was in front of him, "tell me what you came to say." Falcone leaned forward. In the dim light, his heavy face cast shadows that made him look older, harder. He folded his hands on the table the way men do when they want you to notice how calm they are. "We're businessmen," Falcone began. "You're a businessman. Harlem is a market. Markets work better when there's organization, when there's order. Right now, there's no order. There's competition. Competition creates waste. We're here to talk about eliminating waste." Bumpy took a slow sip of water. "I run an orderly operation," he said. "You run your operation," Falcone said. "We're talking about the whole market." The word "whole" landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Bumpy set down the glass. He looked at Falcone with the particular expression, flat assessing, almost bored, that men who had faced him across tables for decades had learned to fear more than shouting. Because shouting meant emotion, that expression meant calculation. "Keep talking," Bumpy said, and so Falcone talked, and the 12-16 men around the room held their positions, and the temperature in the social club on East 116th dropped 2 degrees as the night pressed on, and nobody moved. Yet. The word 30 hit the table like a brick through glass. 30%. Of everything. Numbers policy, the street tax on every corner operation that paid into Bumpy's network across Harlem from 110th Street to the bridge. Monthly. Tosas, guaranteed. Delivered through Rico, who would serve as the collection intermediary, a detail that told Bumpy everything he needed to know about how long this arrangement had been in planning. Falcone presented it the way men present things they believe are inevitable. Not as a proposal. As an announcement of geography. Here is where the border is now. Here is what belongs to whom the decision has already been made. We are simply informing you. 30%, Bumpy said. Clean and simple, Falcone said. No disruption to your day-to-day. Nobody bothers your people. We stay out of your internal business. You continue to run Harlem the way you run it. We simply participate in the revenue. Participate, Bumpy said. That's right. The room was so quiet, Bumpy could hear the radiator ticking in the far corner, a dry metallic pulse like a clock running slightly wrong. He could hear the breathing of the man standing directly behind his right shoulder, one of Falcone's men positioned there, since Bumpy sat down close enough that the heat of the man's body was faintly detectable through the back of Bumpy's jacket. He had been aware of that man since the first 30 seconds. He had not moved his chair. Bumpy looked at the table surface between himself and Falcone. Dark wood old, scarred with rings from glasses set down over decades of conversations. Exactly like this one, conversations where men with power sat across from other men with power and tried to determine whose version of reality would be allowed to continue existing. Then he placed both hands flat on the table. No fists, no aggression in the gesture. Just his hands open, palms down, fingers spread as though he were reading something written in the grain of the wood. "No," he said. One word, no elaboration, no counteroffer. No attempt to negotiate the percentage down or propose alternative arrangements. Just the word dropped into the center of the room, and then silence. Historians and criminologists who have studied this period note that direct refusals in this context were extraordinarily rare. The social and physical risks were understood by everyone present. Falcone's expression didn't change, but something changed behind it. The eyes went slightly flatter, the way eyes do when a mind that was running one calculation abruptly switches to another. "You should think about that answer," Falcone said. "I have," Bumpy said. "Think longer. I've given you my answer." Across the room, the young soldier Bumpy had clocked within 40 seconds of entering 19, maybe 20, positioned near the left wall, clearly new enough to this that his hands hadn't learned yet where to rest. That young man's right hand moved. Not far. 2 inches, maybe 3, toward the front of his jacket. Bumpy saw it. His man near the kitchen saw it. The bartender saw it. Nobody said anything. Falcone raised one hand slightly. Not a dramatic gesture, barely a lift of 2 fingers from the table, and the young soldier's hand stopped moving. The room exhaled without exhaling. "You're making a statement," Falcone said. His voice had changed now. Still controlled, but the warmth was entirely gone. What was underneath was something harder and more honest. "I respect a man who makes statements, but statements have consequences. You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand what you're telling me," Bumpy said. "Then, you understand that this conversation can go 2 directions." "Most conversations can," Bumpy said. "The question is which direction the person across the table is actually prepared to go." The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. It pressed against the walls of the room. It accumulated in the corners where Falcone's men stood watching. It sat between the 2 men at the table like a third presence breathing on its own. Falcone studied him. Bumpy met the study without expression, without movement, both hands still flat on the table. Outside, a sound distant, indistinct, the groan of a door or a vehicle, or the building itself settling against the cold. Small enough to be nothing, specific enough to mean something to anyone in that room who was paying attention. Bumpy's eyes didn't move toward the sound, but he registered it, filed it. "You're going to walk out of here," Falcone said finally, "and you're going to think about what 30% looks like compared to what comes next. And in 48 hours, Rico is going to bring me your answer. The real answer." Bumpy pushed back his chair slowly. Stood. He buttoned the top button of his jacket. Straightened his cuffs. Then he looked at Falcone with an expression that contained something Falcone would spend the next 6 hours trying to correctly identify. It wasn't defiance exactly, and it wasn't contempt exactly, and it certainly wasn't fear. It was the expression of a man who had already decided how this ended, who had made the decision before he walked in the door. "You'll have an answer in 48 hours, Bumpy said. He turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the room held its collective breath, and in the left wall position, The young soldier's hand moved again, this time 3 inches further than before. The click was small, barely audible, the sound of a hammer being drawn back, restrained immediately, when the man next to him grabbed his wrist and squeezed hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Bumpy heard it. He did not break stride. He walked out into the cold Harlem night, past his men at the door, past the empty street into the dark. Behind him, the door of the social club swung shut with a heavy final sound. And what nobody in that room knew, what Falcone wouldn't find out until it was too late, was that Bumpy's 48-hour answer had been prepared before the meeting began. It was already in motion. On 3 separate corners, in 2 separate boroughs, through channels that had nothing to do with Rico. The meeting had never been about negotiating. It had been about giving Falcone 48 hours of false confidence. And inside the social club on East 116th, the young soldier with the unsteady hand sat down hard in a chair, staring at the closed door, trying to understand why the man who just refused a room full of guns didn't look like a man who had just made the worst mistake of his life. He looked like a man who had just made a move. The first shot didn't come from across the table. It came from behind. Bumpy was 3 steps from the door, coat buttoned, cuffs straight-mined, already running the next 48 hours when the sound cracked through the social club like a bone breaking. Not the thunderclap of a large caliber, something smaller, closer. The specific, intimate sound of a gun fired in an enclosed space by someone who didn't want the whole street to hear. He felt the air move before he understood what happened. To his left, his man Marcus, 26 years old, 7 years on Bumpy's crew, the one Bumpy had personally pulled off a corner in 1944 and given a real job. Marcus was on the floor. Not falling. Already down. The shot had taken him behind the left ear at a range of less than 4 feet. Bumpy turned. The man holding the gun was Eddie Rawls. Eddie Rawls, who had been with Bumpy for 11 years. Eddie Rawls, who had driven Bumpy to the hospital when his daughter was born. Eddie Rawls, who knew every route, every exit, every safe house, every name in the operation, because Bumpy had trusted him with all of it over 11 years of proved loyalty and shared risk. Eddie Rawls, who was now standing 6 feet away with a .38 revolver, pointed at Bumpy's chest, and whose hand was shaking so badly, the gun trembled in the dim light like something alive and afraid. "Eddie," Bumpy said. His voice was completely flat. No shock. No betrayal audible in the single word. Because Bumpy Johnson had learned in 23 years of Harlem that the moment you let a man see what his action costs, you is the moment you hand him a second weapon. "Don't," Eddie said. His voice was wrecked, high and broken like a man who had rehearsed this moment 10,000 times and found the reality of it entirely different from the rehearsal. "Don't reach. Don't move. Just stand there." The room had gone completely still. Falcone's 16 men, who 30 seconds ago had been the primary threat in the room, were now motionless along the walls, recalculating, waiting, watching a situation unfold that none of them had been told to expect. Which told Bumpy everything. This wasn't Falcone's play. Falcone looked as surprised as anyone, which meant Eddie had been working a third angle. Not Italian money, something else. Someone else. "How much?" Bumpy said. "Bumpy, how much did they pay you, Eddie?" Unofficial accounts from that period passed through Harlem's network of barbershops, churches, and late-night card games suggest figures ranging from $5,000 to $20,000, though the true amount was never confirmed. Eddie's jaw worked. His eyes were wet. "It wasn't about the money," he started. "It's always about the money," Bumpy said. "Or it's about something someone told you the money represented. Either way, it's money. How much?" "15,000, Eddie said, barely a whisper. "And they said you were going to sell us out, that the deal with the Italians was already done, that you were going to take the 30% and let them have the corners and we'd all be working for Falcone by spring." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. "And you believed that?" Eddie stopped. Something crossed his face that might have been the specific agony of a man who has just in this exact second understood that he was lied to, that the story he was sold was constructed precisely to produce the action he was currently taking. "Bumpy, You should have asked me," Bumpy said. Then he moved. Not toward Eddie, not away. Sideways, a single sharp step left that took him out of the direct line of the barrel. In the same instant, his right hand came up from his coat pocket, already closed around the grip of his own weapon. Eddie fired. The shot went wide, punched into the wooden doorframe to Bumpy's right, spraying splinters that cut across Bumpy's cheek in a hot line. Bumpy didn't fire once. He fired twice in a rhythm so controlled it sounded almost mechanical. Center mass. Eddie went back against the wall and slid down it slowly, like something deflating, the gun clattering away from his hand before he reached the floor. The whole sequence, step-draw fire, had taken less than 2 seconds. For a moment, nothing in the room moved. Then everything moved at once. One of Falcone's men on the right wall went for his weapon. Bumpy's man at the bar came over the top with both hands and tackled him before the gun cleared the holster, both of them crashing into a table that collapsed under the weight glass, exploding across the floor. The man near the kitchen doorway stepped into the room with his weapon up, covering the left side, a clean professional sweep. No hesitation. Falcone shoved back from the table, knocking his chair into the man behind him, and the domino effect sent 2 soldiers stumbling into each other in the tight space behind the far wall. Bumpy picked up the table between himself and the chaos, a heavy thing, solid wood 50 years old, and drove it forward like a battering ram into the cluster of men who had been positioned directly across from him. It caught 2 of them at hip height and sent them down hard onto the concrete floor, one of them cracking his head with a sound that ended his participation in the evening immediately. The room was noise and motion, and the acrid burn of gunpowder thickening the air. 2 more shots from somewhere on the right side. Bumpy couldn't tell who fired, couldn't tell the direction, felt one pass close enough to disturb the air beside his left ear. He was already moving toward Falcone. Not because Falcone was a physical threat, because Falcone was the signal. Whatever happened to Falcone in the next 30 seconds would determine whether the remaining men in the room fought or ran. Bumpy had understood this before he tipped the table. In every room there is one person whose status determines the behavior of everyone else. You don't fight the army. You remove the flag. Falcone had gotten to his feet and was backing toward the far wall, one hand raised, whether in surrender or to signal his men, impossible to tell in the chaos. Bumpy crossed the room in 4 strides. He grabbed Falcone by the lapels of his jacket, expensive wool charcoal gray, the kind of suit that cost more than most Harlem families spent on food in a month, and drove him back against the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. Their faces were 8 inches apart. "Listen to me carefully," Bumpy said. His voice was the same as it had been when he said Eddie's name, flat, controlled, a voice that had not risen 1 degree in temperature despite everything that had happened in the last 90 seconds. "Call them off, right now, or this room gets a lot quieter." Falcone's eyes, up close, stripped of the calculated warmth he'd worn at the table, were the eyes of a man doing rapid and unfavorable arithmetic. "Stand down," Falcone said, loud enough to carry. "Stand down." Everyone stop. The room didn't go silent, but it went slower. And in the sudden reduction of chaos, Bumpy heard something that changed the calculation entirely. Outside, distant but approaching, moving fast through the Harlem night, the sound of sirens. Multiple sirens. Coming this way. He released Falcone, looked at the room, looked at the door, and understood that the night was not over. It had not even reached its worst point yet. Smoke doesn't just obscure a room. It changes the room's physics. It compresses distance. It flattens depth. It turns men into shapes and shapes into shadows, and in the specific hell of a closed space full of gunpowder smoke and overturned furniture and the sounds of men trying to determine whether the person nearest them is an ally or a target, it reduces human decision-making to its absolute core. You move or you don't, you shoot or you don't, you go forward or you go back. Bumpy Johnson went forward. Not because forward was safe. Forward was the least safe direction in the room. Two of Falcone's men had regrouped near the far wall and were bringing their weapons up, and the angles were wrong. Bumpy was exposed on his left side. His man from the kitchen was blocked by the overturned table, and the bartender was down on the floor behind the bar dealing with his own situation. Forward was not safe. Forward was the only direction that ended this. He moved in a straight line across the room, low, fast firing once at the nearer of the two men by the far wall. A shot that caught the man in the shoulder and spun him sideways, taking him out of the immediate equation, without the permanence of a kill shot, because Bumpy was not running the mathematics of revenge tonight. He was running the mathematics of survival and control. The second man hesitated for half a second, that specific hesitation of a person whose plan just changed, because the person executing the opposite plan didn't behave according to any reasonable expectation. Half a second is an enormous amount of time when both people in an equation are moving. Bumpy covered the remaining distance and drove his elbow into the second man's jaw with the full momentum of his forward motion behind it. The man went sideways and down hit the wall and stayed there. 2 down. He turned. The room was unrecognizable as the social club it had been 12 minutes ago. 2 tables overturned, chairs scattered and broken, the bar mirror shattered. He didn't know when that had happened, hadn't heard it in the general noise. The single overhead light was still burning, throwing everything in sharp yellow shadow that made the smoke look almost solid. Marcus was still on the floor near the door where he'd fallen. Bumpy registered this with the part of his mind that would process it later in a different place when processing was something he could afford. Eddie Rawls was against the wall where he'd slid. Not moving, Falcone was standing in the center of the room with both hands slightly raised, watching Bumpy with an expression that had moved through several stages in the last 30 seconds and arrived somewhere that looked remarkably like professional respect. 3 of Falcone's remaining men were still functional and armed. They were also very still positioned in a rough triangle around the room, and none of them were moving toward anything because the situation had produced an outcome that none of their preparation had accounted for. No official police report from that night documents the full number of individuals present or the precise sequence of events. The record that exists is fragmentary and deliberately incomplete. "Here's where we are," Bumpy said. He was breathing harder than he would have liked. Not from fear, from the physical reality of crossing a room at speed and putting 2 men down in under 10 seconds. His cheek was bleeding from the splinter cut. He could feel it but not see it, a warm tracking line down the left side of his face. "You've got 3 men standing. I've got 2. Your man on the floor is going to need a doctor, but he'll live. Mine near the bar." He glanced, confirmed. His back up. "The ones who ran are gone and they're not coming back tonight. So we're looking at a room that's approximately even, and we've got police coming from at least 2 directions." Falcone lowered his hand slightly. He was a man reassessing an entire framework in real time. Bumpy could see it happening, the recalibration behind the eyes, the way a face changes when it accepts that the story it was operating inside has been replaced by a different story. "You came here to negotiate," Bumpy continued. "I told you no. Then someone in this room tried to change the answer by putting a bullet in my man. That someone is no longer a factor." He paused. "Let that sit. So we're back to the original question, except now we've got sirens getting closer and a room that tells a story nobody in this space wants told." Falcone looked at the floor, looked at the wall, looked at Bumpy. "The sirens," he said. "Yeah," Bumpy said. "Someone called them." "Someone always calls them," Bumpy said. The question is who they come to help. That question landed in the room and nobody rushed to answer it because the answer was not simple, and everyone present understood that the answer determined the next 30 minutes of their lives. Outside, the sirens were close enough now that the sound was bouncing off the buildings, filling 116th Street, with its echo making it impossible to tell exactly how close or exactly how many. Falcone made a decision. Bumpy watched him make it, watched the specific moment when a man stops calculating and commits to a direction. "My men," Falcone said in a voice pitched to carry to the three still standing, "are going to collect our people and leave through the back. Now, quietly." Nobody in the room objected. Bumpy stepped aside. Falcone crossed the room toward the back hallway, then stopped, turned, looked at Bumpy across the wreckage of the social club on East 116th, across the overturned tables and the broken glass and the sharp smell of gunpowder that had soaked into the walls and would still be there a week later. "This isn't finished," Falcone said. "I know," Bumpy said. "You understand what comes next." "I've understood what comes next since I walked through that door," Bumpy said. "The difference between us is that I was ready for it before I arrived." Falcone held his gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he turned and walked into the back hallway and was gone. The 3 remaining soldiers followed, moving fast without running. The sound of a rear exit opening and closing. Footsteps on pavement fading into the night. Then nothing. Bumpy stood in the destroyed room and counted. 3 seconds. 5. 8. "Move," he said. The sirens hit the street outside like a physical force. Blue and red light strobed through the frosted front window of the social club, sweeping across the wrecked interior in slow rotating pulses, illuminating overturned chairs. The collapsed table, the dark stains spreading across the floor near the door, and then sweeping on indifferent mechanical. The rotating light of official presence arriving at the scene of something it would never fully document. Bumpy had 45 seconds between Falcone's exit and the moment the first car stopped outside. He used every one of them. "Back door," he said to his man from the kitchen, whose name was Samuel, 31 years old, formerly of the 369th Infantry Regiment, a man who had learned in Korea that the most important skill in a collapsing situation is the ability to prioritize tasks in the correct sequence without being told twice. Samuel was already moving. The bartender Darnell, 19 years in Harlem's underground economy, a man who had cleaned up worse than this and understood that cleaning up was a form of testimony, came over the bar with a canvas bag that had not been visible before, and began working the room with the focused efficiency of someone executing a rehearsed plan. Bumpy crossed to where Marcus lay near the door. He crouched, checked. Marcus was gone, had been gone since he hit the floor, the shot behind the ear having been precise in the worst possible sense. Bumpy stayed crouched for exactly 3 seconds. Not long enough for grief, long enough to make the acknowledgement that the situation required. Then he stood and kept moving. "He comes with us," Bumpy said. "We don't leave him here." 2 men lifted Marcus. They moved toward the back hallway. Bumpy was the last one through. At the hallway entrance, he stopped and looked back at the room one final time, at Darnell still working at the evidence of what had happened in the last 20 minutes, written across every surface at the specific quality of a room that has absorbed violence and now holds it in its walls, the way old wood holds water. Then he turned and walked into the dark of the back hallway. The rear exit of the social club opened onto a narrow service alley that ran parallel to 116th, accessible from the street only through a gap between 2 buildings that a person who didn't know to look for it would walk past without seeing. Bumpy's car was not 2 blocks east where he'd left it. It was already in the alley, engine running, because Samuel had made 1 phone call from the kitchen during the meeting, a contingency arranged before anyone arrived. They were moving before the first officer reached the front door of the club. The events of that night were later described in court documents related to an unconnected case as, and these are the court's own words, "an incident of uncertain origin involving persons unknown, which may be the most accurate official description of anything that happened in Harlem in 1951. Detective Raymond Cole arrived on scene at 12:31 a.m. Cole was 44 years old, 18 years on the force assigned to the precinct that covered East Harlem and the northern edge of Bumpy's territory. He was also, as several parties on several sides of Harlem's permanent Cold War were aware, a man whose salary from the city of New York was supplemented by income from sources the city of New York did not know about. He walked through the front door of the social club, looked at the room, and stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned to the uniformed officer behind him and said, "Secure the perimeter. Nobody in or out until I say." The uniformed officer went back outside. Cole walked through the room slowly. He looked at the floor near the door. He looked at the overturned tables. He looked at the bar where Darnell had been working, and where the evidence of Darnell's work was visible to someone who knew what to look for, which Cole did, because Cole had seen rooms like this before, rooms that had been partially processed before the law arrived. He pulled out a notebook, wrote something in it, put it away. Then he walked to the back hallway and looked down it at the rear exit standing slightly ajar at the cold October air pushing through the gap at the empty alley beyond. One of the uniformed officers appeared at the front door. "Detective, we've got a witness. Woman from the building across the street says she heard shots, says she saw men leaving through the front about 20 minutes ago." "How many men?" Cole said. "She's not sure. It was dark. Italian, black in between." She said she couldn't tell." Cole nodded. "Get her statement. Be thorough." He paused. "Take your time with it." The officer went back outside. Cole stood alone in the back hallway for a moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a different notebook, smaller, older, the kind with a worn leather cover, and wrote something in that one instead. Then he put it away, walked back through the wrecked social club, and stepped out onto 116th Street. The street was alive with blue and red light. A small crowd had gathered at the corner despite the cold and the hour. Harlem never entirely slept, and Harlem always knew when something real had happened, even before it knew what the something was. Cole looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at Cole. Nobody said anything. By 1:15 a.m., the scene had been processed in the particular way that scenes get processed, when the people processing them have interests in what gets found and what doesn't. 3 shell casings were recovered and logged. Several more were not. A notebook found near the bar contained names that were copied into Cole's smaller notebook before the larger notebook was logged into evidence. At 7:40 a.m., the New York-Amsterdam News received a brief statement from the NYPD describing a shooting incident of undetermined origin on East 116th Street in which no fatalities were confirmed at the scene. A statement so carefully constructed that it was technically accurate while describing almost nothing that had actually happened. By 9 a.m., the statement had been repeated in 2 other papers. By 10 a.m., nobody in Harlem was reading the papers. They were talking to each other, in barbershops and churches and the back rooms of numbers operations and the corners where men stood with their collars up against the October cold. Talking the way Harlem talked when official versions of events arrived pre-sanitized, and the real information had to be assembled from fragments and inference and the testimony of people who had been there or been adjacent to there or known someone who had. The story that assembled itself through those conversations was not the story in the papers. It was a story about a meeting that was supposed to end one way and ended another. About a man who walked into a room with 16 guns pointed in his direction and walked out through the back while the law stood at the front trying to understand what it was looking at. About a room that had been cleaned before the police arrived, and a detective who arrived already knowing what he would and would not find. And underneath all of it, moving through the assembled story like a current under cold water, was the question that nobody said out loud, but everybody was asking. If Bumpy Johnson walked out of that room, if the Italian operation lost 16 men and a capo's confidence in a single night, and the police found nothing that could be used, then what exactly had changed by morning? Who held Harlem now? The answer came not in a statement, not in a newspaper, not through any official channel. It came the following morning when the numbers runners made their rounds, and every collection point in Harlem from 110th Street to the bridge opened on schedule, paid out on schedule, and operated exactly as they had the day before, with one difference that everyone noticed and nobody mentioned. Nobody came to collect 30%. Nobody came to collect anything. Harlem ran clean that morning, ran quiet, ran under one name. And that name had walked out through a service alley at 12:29 a.m., while the sirens were still finding the street. Harlem woke up knowing something had changed. Not because anyone announced it. Not because the papers said so. The 3-paragraph item buried on page 7 described an unspecified disturbance, with no names and no details. But Harlem didn't read the papers for the truth. Harlem read the streets, and the streets were telling a very specific story. By 6 a.m., every Italian-adjacent collection point between 112th and 120th was gone. Not just unmanned, cleaned out. Tables, folded chalk marks scuffed away as though the operations had never existed. The numbers runners were moving faster than usual, collecting faster, not lingering anywhere long enough for questions to find them. Bumpy had not slept. He sat in the kitchen of a safe apartment on St. Nicholas Avenue, not his address, not connected to his name anywhere, drinking black coffee and thinking about what Falcone would do next. The answer wasn't complicated. A man who'd walked into that social club with 16 guns and walked out through the back while sirens filled the street had suffered something worse than a failed negotiation. He'd suffered humiliation in front of his own men, and men like Falcone didn't absorb humiliation. They responded to it. "They're going to hit 3 points simultaneously," Bumpy told Samuel when the morning report came in. "Lennox operation, the 118th Street drop, and the loan office on 8th. Tonight after midnight." Samuel looked at him. "We pull back." "We don't pull back from anything," Bumpy said. "Pulling back hands them the territory before they take a single step. But we change what's waiting for them when they arrive." By 10 a.m., he had visited 11 businesses on the corridor between 110th and 125th. Barbershops, dry goods stores, restaurants. Each conversation was short and direct. "There's going to be activity in the next 36 hours. He told Curtis Webb, a restaurant owner who had been in Harlem since 1923. "Keep your doors open during the day. Keep your people inside after 8. If anyone asks what you saw nothing." Curtis Webb looked at him the way men of his generation looked at facts they'd long accepted. "Is it going to be bad?" "It's going to be over," Bumpy said. "That's what matters." Accounts of what followed exist primarily in Harlem's oral tradition. Formal records from this period are sparse, and researchers note significant gaps in the documentary evidence. By noon, 11 business owners had made their choice. Not because they had no fear, because they understood that neutrality in a moment like this was itself a choice with consequences that would outlast the moment by years. They chose Harlem, which meant they chose the man who held it. By 3 p.m., every corner between 110th and the bridge had stopped reporting upward to Italian-connected intermediaries. Not because of any general order, because the men on those corners, working with functional survival instincts and a full day of accumulating information, had made the same individual calculation and arrived at the same conclusion. The wind had changed. By 6 p.m., Bumpy was back at St. Nicholas reviewing positions with Samuel. The handwritten list covered 3 locations, 12 men, 4 contingency routes. "They'll move after midnight," Bumpy said. "We are not meeting them at our locations. We are meeting them on the way to our locations. Before they arrive." He paused. "You understand the difference?" Samuel understood. It was the difference between defense and termination. The night came down over Harlem like a curtain. Underneath it, in doorways and alleys and the backs of parked cars on a dozen different blocks, men took their positions and waited with the patience of people who have been told exactly what is coming and exactly when. 36 hours after a deal died on East 116th, Harlem held its breath. Then the night stopped being quiet. 3 locations, 3 crews. Midnight. It was not a bad plan. Simultaneous pressure, overwhelming force, fast execution before any crew could warn another. The kind of coordinated action that had worked for the Genovese family before in other neighborhoods where the geography of power was more predictable. Harlem was not other neighborhoods. Falcone's crew turned onto 118th Street at 12:07 a.m. with 7 men moving with the confidence of people who believe they are the aggressor. Heads up, weapons accessible, the body language of men executing a plan they trust. They made it 40 feet into the block. What happened next took 11 seconds. 4 of the 7 went down. 2 ran north on Lenox. 1 dropped to his knees with both hands visible, the only reason he was still breathing. Bumpy's crew took 1 injury, a graze across the forearm. Bloody but not serious. The second location produced similar results in similar time. The third location was where Falcone himself waited, not in the action, but nearby in a car on the adjacent block, the standard position for a man of his rank. You directed. You didn't expose yourself. Bumpy had anticipated this. He went to the car himself, knocked on the window the way you knock on a neighbor's door, deliberately. Without urgency. The driver had his hand on his weapon when the glass came down. Then he saw who was standing on the sidewalk. His hand stopped moving. Falcone in the back seat took 3 full seconds to understand what he was looking at. Bumpy watched the processing happen, disbelief first, then calculation, then the particular stillness of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. Bumpy opened the rear door and got in. He sat beside Falcone without drawing his weapon, without raising his voice, and said nothing for 30 seconds. Outside 116th Street continued its midnight existence, indifferent to what was happening inside the car. "It's done," Bumpy said. Falcone's hands were folded in his lap with the rigidity of conscious control. 3 locations, he said. 3 locations. How? "I've been in Harlem 23 years, Bumpy said. "You've been trying to move in for 2. You came with numbers and money and a plan. All of that works against people who don't know you're coming." He let that sit. "I knew you were coming before you decided you were coming." Falcone looked straight ahead. "The meeting was never a negotiation. The meeting was a conversation," Bumpy said. "Conversations give you information. Information is worth more than 30% of anything." What has been passed down through Harlem's oral tradition about that night should be understood as exactly that tradition, shaped by retelling, carrying truth in its bones, even where specific details have shifted over decades. "What do you want?" Falcone said, a genuine question, not an offer. "Nothing from you," Bumpy said. "I want exactly nothing from you. Go back downtown. Tell whoever needs to hear it that Harlem has an arrangement, the arrangement it has always had, and that arrangement does not include external participation." "There are people above me," Falcone said carefully. "People with interests in how this resolves." "Then have that conversation," Bumpy said. "Tell them what you learned tonight." He opened the car door. Cold October air came in off the street, carrying pavement and night and the smell of a city that continues regardless of what happens inside any particular car on any particular block. Harlem is not a market, not a territory, not a percentage. It runs itself. He got out, stood on the sidewalk, watched the car pull slowly away and head south. Then he turned north and walked back into Harlem. By 4 a.m. the blocks were clear. By 6 the streets looked exactly as they always looked. No one claimed responsibility for anything. No one ever would. The morning after came in gray and cold. No storm clearing. No symbolic light breaking through clouds. Just flat October pressing down on buildings that looked the same as yesterday and would look the same tomorrow. Harlem was very good at looking the same on the outside, while everything on the inside had changed. Samuel came in at 6:30 with coffee and a short report. All 3 locations hit the previous night were operational by 7 a.m. Cornermen were back in position, collections running on schedule. The Italian adjacent points that had gone dark remained dark. The 30% conversation was over. "The man on his knees," Bumpy said. 118th Street. "Released last night," Samuel said. He walked home. That decision had been deliberate. A dead soldier generates a response. A released soldier delivers a message we could have, and we chose not to. That message communicated something no body ever could. It communicated control. Cold absolute control from a man operating not from rage but from a clear understanding of what each action produces. "Marcus," Bumpy said, "family's been taken care of last night." Bumpy was quiet. Outside, a child on the sidewalk stopped to examine something on the pavement with the total absorption children bring to things adults have learned to walk past. Bumpy watched him for a moment. Then he finished his coffee. The full account of those 48 hours exists nowhere in any single complete document. It lives in pieces, in memories of people mostly gone now, and in the shape of what came after. 3 things happened in the weeks that followed. Carmine Falcone was transferred to a New Jersey operation, internally described as routine reassignment, believed by no one who knew what had happened on East 116th. Detective Raymond Cole retired in November at 44 years old, citing health reasons, and moved to a house in Queens that cost considerably more than a detective's pension could explain. Rico Alvarez simply disappeared. Apartment empty, circuits abandoned, gone without announcement or explanation. No one asked too many questions about any of it. What remained was a neighborhood operating under a clarity it hadn't had before. Not peace. Harlem was never exactly peaceful, but order. The specific order that exists when one authority is recognized as final, and the question of who holds a territory has been answered so completely it no longer needs repeating. No trial was ever held for the events of late October 1951. No grand jury convened. The files sat in a precinct storage room for years, then were moved. Then at some point in the 1960s were simply gone, misfiled, misplaced, or removed by hands that left no record of the removal. The official history of those 48 hours is essentially blank. The real history lived in Harlem, in the streets that stayed clear, in the corners that kept running, in the shop owners who kept their doors open and their mouths shut, in the particular ease with which people moved through those blocks in the months that followed, the specific confidence of a neighborhood that has resolved a question about itself. In late November, a restaurant owner on 121st stopped Bumpy on the sidewalk. "I heard there were people who thought they could come in here and change things," the man said. "That thought Harlem was just a place." Bumpy looked at him. "Harlem's just a place," Bumpy said. "It's the people in it that aren't replaceable." He kept walking, coat buttoned against the November cold. Same pace as always, not hurried, not slow. A man in his neighborhood on an ordinary morning. The name that by December 1951 needed no explanation to anyone operating on any block between the park and the bridge was not posted anywhere, not printed, not recorded. It lived in the streets, in the walls, in the texture of a neighborhood that had been tested and had held. Bumpy Johnson walked those streets every morning, and every morning Harlem was exactly where he'd left it. Harlem never held a trial for what happened that October. No courtroom, no verdict, no official record that any of it occurred. The walls of that social club on East 116th absorbed the gunpowder and kept the secret the way old buildings keep everything quietly, permanently, without being asked. Bumpy Johnson lived 17 more years after that night. He walked those streets until his body wouldn't let him anymore, And in all that time, no one came back to collect 30% of anything. Some victories don't get written down. They get lived. If this story stayed with you, there are dozens more like it waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And thank you genuinely for watching until the end. Now tell us, do you think Bumpy Johnson was a criminal or the only law Harlem ever really had? And if you were in that room when the offer hit the table, would you have walked away or fought back?